when we talk about how they responded to the conquerors, a lot depends on which communities we're talking about and where they lived. I mean, the big picture that emerges, and here I'm drawing heavily on the work of a now deceased French scholar named Yves Modéron, who wrote a book about basically the Moors in late antiquity and the early Islamic period. And one of his great insights from that book is that the Moorish populations of late antiquity who had lived outside the orbit of Roman control and were less Christianized and more pagan, especially those living in the deserts of Libya, i.e., the people that the Arabs would have encountered first as they marched west from Egypt, because the conquest came from the direction of Egypt.
Yeah.
Those people were by and large early and enthusiastic supporters of the new political and military presence in the region. So
Really?
the most famous example of this is a group based in modern day Libya known as the Lawata Berbers. In late antiquity, they were known as the Lagawatan Moors. So they show up in our earliest history as the conquest of the region as sort of submitting to the conquerors, paying jizya, an anachronistic term in this context we should take to mean just a form of tribute that also included slaves. And they go over to Islam early, and it seems that they also, part of this process entails conversion, and part of the process also entails kind of joining the conquering army, because members of this tribe and others that hailed from these kind of less Romanized regions of what is today the desert of Libya, they show up as officers and soldiers in the Muslim army. So there doesn't seem to be a huge problem with these people. The problem for the conqueror arises when they head into the heavily Romanized territories, the heavily Christianized territories where Moorish Berber populations predominated. And the most important of these was a region called Southern Numidia. Numidia is a name of the Roman province that more or less corresponds with Eastern Algeria. And in the southern portion of Numidia, you get a mountain massif called the Auras, Jabal Auras in Arabic. It's still there, it's still extremely famous, still known by the same name. And this is basically a mountain that mediates between the Algerian Tell, the big coastal mountain range, very verdant, lots of agriculture, lots of intensive Roman settlement. And then to the south of it, so that's north of the mountain. To the south of the mountain, you have the desert. So a very interesting place that, not only culturally between worlds, between the Roman and Moorish culture, but is also geographically between the world of kind of sedentarized agricultural communities and then desert nomads to the south. And this is where the conquerors face the biggest trouble. There are lots of reasons for this, but one could basically view it as an example of heavily Romanized, heavily Christianized populations who had, over the course of many centuries, become embedded in Roman imperial politics, and later with the Vandals and the Byzantines, that these were the groups who were the most threatened by the arrival of a new imperial power, and they put up the biggest fight. So two of the great stars of Berber history in the 7th century are these so-called rebel leaders, Kusaila and Al-Kahina. Kusaila seems to have been basically a Berber prince from the Auras region. Al-Kahina is a semi-mythical figure. The name Kahina in Arabic means something like sorceress or prophetess. They lead the revolt against the Umayyads.
I do wonder, Al Kahina, did they, because we don't know, was she a Christian? I know there's a debate if she was Christian or was she had a Jewish background. And I look at the name Al Kahina, I understand Kahan or Kahin is an important word in Judaism. And I wonder if there's was that name back projected onto her? Did she identify as that? I know there's a bit of mystery concerning her. We almost were going to leave her out of this conversation because I didn't know exactly where to put her. But because you mentioned her, I'm just inquiring a little bit more about her background because it seems
Yeah.
like she did put up a resistance. Seems like she did have an Abrahamic religious faith that maybe she was trying to hold on to. And I was wondering, was it because of that reason that she put up a resistance to the Umayyads?
I think that there were probably many reasons why this character may have put up resistance. Both of these characters that I mentioned, Kusaila and El Kahina, who rise up against the Umayyads within just a few years of each other. They're artifacts of legend as much as artifacts of history, and for this reason, many historians prefer to ignore them as completely fictional. So I am fully aware of this. I'm alive to the historical problems. What interests me about them, maybe a way of answering your question, is that they reflect patterns of political life in North Africa generally, and in this Auras region specifically, that go way back to late antiquity. I mean, the Romans, the Vandals, and the Byzantines may have been in charge, but there were these Moorish principalities that formed on the marches of the empire in precisely these regions. And so, to my eyes at least, Kusaila and Al-Kahina look a whole lot like people that were doing similar things. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, these continuities of rebellion and negotiation with imperial power. The same thing happens in this region of southern Numidia. Um, Kusaila is explicitly labeled as a Christian in the Arabic sources. The religion of Al-Kahina is left ambiguous, but precisely because of the cultural and social profile of these Berber populations living in this region of southern Numidia, in and around the Auras mountain, I think that if there is a historical reality underlying Al-Kahina, it's safe to say that she was probably a Christian, and probably not a pagan, probably not a Jew. I mean, the sorts of the details that you're alluding to that lead to confusion about who she was, what was her religion, what led her to revolt. I mean, this is all the product of the accretion of many, many centuries of myth making on the part of medieval authors, to say nothing of modern observers of the past, modern authors of history in the modern states of Tunisia, Algeria, and elsewhere. I mean, I think as best as we can say, she's probably a Christian. And the term Al-Kahina is, again, if there is any historical reality to this person, is not a personal name, but is rather a title. The allusion that I prefer to see is not an allusion to ancient Judaism, but rather is probably an allusion to the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic age of ignorance that we associate especially with the cultures of the Arabian Peninsula, which was a world filled with religious specialists, including the Kuhan, the soothsayers, who are mentioned in the Quran. I mean, interestingly, Prophet Muhammad is accused of being one such kahin. So I think that is the illusion that these medieval authors are making when they portray her as Al-Kahina. She is an artifact of a North African Jahiliyyah that is mixed up with paganism and Christianity. So that's the way I understand her.